Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. All right, I'm here with Steve Scherer. He's the former bureau chief in Ottawa for Reuters and my former boss. And I was thinking of having a conversation about what it's like coming to cover Canadian politics from an outside perspective. Steve is from the US originally, but spent 21 years in Italy and was called out by Berlusconi a couple of times as well during his adventures there. But I wanted to just kind of get a sense of, I guess, what you when you took the assignment in Ottawa, what you were expecting when you came here, and what you kind of saw when you arrived.
Well, I think it's best to start a little bit to describe Italy, right? Because
Right.
that's kind of what I have to compare to as a foreign correspondent coming to Canada. So I'd worked in Italy for more than 2 decades, and I'd followed many governments. I'm sure you've heard this before, but they've had almost 70 governments since World War II. So there's a lot of sort of internal instability within the coalitions that form governments in
Right.
Italy. Um, it is a similar well, it's a parliamentary system. It's like Canada, so not like the United States, and so I was used to that part of things. Let's say, but it was as you mentioned Berlusconi. Yeah, Silvio Berlusconi was a very colorful character to say the least. Embroiled in scandals involving prostitutes and actually a harem that he had set up more or less to imitate Gaddafi, who he admired for all the women he would take around with him when he went even to travel, for
Mhm.
diplomatic reasons. So anyway, it was a very busy assignment to be in Italy. If it wasn't a coalition arguing with itself, because there's a lot of coalition politics in Italy. There were elections. If there weren't elections, there was an earthquake. If there wasn't an earthquake, some other disaster would strike, a bridge would collapse or something. There was always something to cover in Italy. It was really a frantic life for an agency journalist, let's say, in
Right.
Italy. So coming to Canada, I thought things were going to be a lot more calm, and I thought politics is going to be a lot more, sort of boring. There's not going to be, this coalition push and pull, um, and I kind of expected it to be more like the United States, but in the in like in the 1980s or 90s version of the U.S., not the current one, right?
Right.
So I was surprised. I was surprised. Well, first of all, the first election I covered was the 2019 election, and it was pretty nasty.
Yeah.
It got really nasty during the campaign. That was when obviously the blackface images of Trudeau were leaked. And
Right.
so and there were shenanigans on both sides. That was a really big one, obviously. And so I realized, that really, Canada is not, it's not boring, and politics are lively, and can be really nasty, but it is a bit different. You're not um uh, um, there's more. I'd say there's more rules and decency here, like in covering
Okay.
things as well. So anyway, it was nastier than I thought it would be, but for a foreign correspondent, it was also easier because here you get like a question and a follow up at the press conference if you get a question. But
Yeah.
normally there are press conferences you can get a question in. You always get a follow up, almost always. In Italy, I mean, it's hard to get the microphone to ask a question if you're not one of the top, if you're not one of the journalists that's following, say, the prime minister or the minister. It's much more it's a different media landscape, and a
Okay.
lot of times your ministers or your prime ministers, they have go-to people and they want them to get the questions. It's not as democratic, let's say, as Canada from that point of view. So I was pleasantly surprised of to to have a little bit more organization. I didn't have to steal the microphone away. Like when Berlusconi got angry with me, I had to literally kind of take the microphone from someone to be able to ask a question, a tough question. Well, you don't really have to do that here.
Yeah.
And it wasn't as great. It wasn't as sort of boring as I thought it would be, because, when it got down to, campaign time, the gloves come off, and there's a lot of interesting, there's wedge issues, there's leaks and all kinds of things. So it did turn out to be, I think, at once more civilized, and at the same time not nearly as sort of lackadaisical or boring than I for some reason thought it would be.
Okay. What surprised you about the political landscape in Canada when you got here?
How different it is from the United States. So not really an Italian comparison there, but when I came to Canada as an American, I was thinking, well, Canada can't be that different from the United States, and instead it is, it is different. And in fact, one of the things that I learned, and I've said this before, in Italy and in the United States, your natural majority is kind of right leaning, right? Whereas in Canada, your natural majority is left leaning. And that has an effect on the tone of politics, I think, and the things you talk about, the social safety net's a much bigger deal here, for example, than it is in the United States, right? So yeah, that was the most surprising thing. I have to say that one of the reasons I came to Canada was because I didn't want to go to that toxic environment of the Trump presidency, in the United States at the time. So when I came in 2019, Trump was still in office, and I didn't want to go anywhere near Washington. So I kind of, picked Canada because I thought, well, at least there, it's not going to be Trump. It's going to be more, it's going to be politics the way, without as much lying, and division, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Even though we are starting to move in that direction as well now.
Yeah, I mean, I have seen a shift since I got here. And I think that has something to do with the fact that the Conservatives can't win an election these days, right? They lost the 2019 and they lost the 2021. And in particular, in 2021, they were, O'Toole was trying to get to the center a little bit. He was playing toward the center, and it didn't work out. So I think that, progressively here in Canada, also, I covered, just like you, the convoy here.
Yeah.
And the blockages on the roads and the bridges a few years ago during the pandemic. So I think progressively Canada's getting a bit more polarized. I don't know that I don't think that dynamic of it being still majority left leaning has changed, but it's more polarized than it was before.
Okay.
And that's obviously partly an effect of being, watching the United States, and then, the social media echo chamber and everything else that we talk about. But I think that Polyev is definitely, taking notes on what he sees happening in the United States. And I don't think that he's, a mini Trump or something.
Right.
But I do think that, that there's this, this example of how you can polarize a population and win an election that probably appeals to him. And with, Trudeau 9 years in, I think there's a certain amount of fatigue that he's going to be able to count on as well. So I do see things moving a little bit more toward the right in Canada. But I mean, before I got here, I didn't cover Harper, but I mean, Canada had been there before. It's just that it wasn't in the post-Trump era, I guess. So it seems a little bit nastier now, I guess, than it did when I first got here.
No, definitely. And I, having been in the gallery for 15 years can absolutely attest that it has gotten much nastier over the course of my career here. One of the other things I'm curious about is, again, from your kind of outsider's perspective, is there something that you are seeing that either in Canadian politics or media that you're able to identify that the rest of us seem to have a blind spot around because we're kind of in the culture a little more?
That's a good question. I think the best way to answer it though is more from like my perspective as a foreign correspondent, right? Like
Right.
it's not really because of a different mentality. It's just a different way of looking at things. So,
Yeah.
I cover the way I think a lot of people forget, and I think it's important to remind them. I know that you're aware of this, that there are institutions that I'm covering a lot of times,
Mhm.
and for a foreign news agency. So my audience is usually not Canadian.
Right.
Is essentially I'm writing for non-Canadian audience normally, and so I am mainly trying to convey what the institutions in Canada are doing or they're going to do,
Yeah.
or what the problem is, with this institution, or and where the power is going to go, right? Is it going to stay in the hands of the Liberals? Is it going to go to the Conservatives? So it's a step backward, I think, from what a Canadian media outlet would cover. We take a step, as a foreign correspondent, you take a step back, and
Yeah.
so I think from that perspective, I think that well, one thing, for example, like the scandals that come up every once in a while.
Yes.
I have a hard time even calling them scandals.
Yes.
After
We
living
seem
in
to have a certain
Italy,
amount of scandal inflation when it comes to our
oh
own
my God, the
audience.
We Charity scandal. What scandal? Like I don't. I really, really, the whole scandal stuff, even the Chinese interference stuff. To me, it seems like people start pulling their hair out and make a huge political hay out of things that are barely exist, or
Yeah.
they exist in a only in the vacuum of, or in the Ottawa bubble, or
Yeah.
the very, very navel gazing kind of issues that turn into scandals, and that's always I've always thought it was ridiculous. I just
Yeah.
think a real scandal is when your prime minister has a harem,
Yes.
and is paying off people not to talk, and that's a scandal.
Yeah.
The We Charity scandal to me was not, and even when I first got here, I remember the what was it called, the one with the Quebec company, SNC Lavalin
Yeah.
scandal. Yeah, I could see the sense of that, right? Especially since basically the government sent packing its one of its ministers who was Indigenous and a woman, and but even there, like if you in my experience, especially in Italy, right, it's very, very
Mhm.
Machiavellian. If you do something your party leader doesn't want, you're out. That's
Yeah.
it. That's just politics. That's and so for me, I wasn't scandalized that Jody Wilson-Raybould had been forced out of the government. I was like, well, of course, like this is politics.
Yeah.
You're the boss is that guy. You do things that make the boss look terrible, or you row against him in some way. You're going to face the consequences. So things like that, I have a hard time understanding in Canada. What the outrage, of for
Yes.
We Charity, and I don't get it. I don't get it at all. And even the outrage for firing a minister, I don't particularly get. That it's just
Mhm.
politics is so brutal. But to go back to what I was saying about institutions, is usually I think that there's, and this happens everywhere, right? You get so focused on the little sort of details of politics and the day in and the day out, and somebody gets offended about this, and somebody did this, and there was a gaffe, and that you really lose sight of the big picture. And the big picture is a lot of times is the Bank of Canada asking itself the right questions, and like our is economic policy helping or hurting right now?
Yeah.
Is inflation getting on the economic side, you're asking those big, and then on the political side, it's is the institution of the government working properly, and what's it working on doing? And for me, it was climate policy and all these sort of big economic incentives that are being put in place that I found really interesting. So the mechanics of of shifting your economy and creating an entire new industrial sector, right? That's what's happening, and I found that really interesting. But that's not what you read about when you read about Canadian politics. Not,
Right.
it's like kind of like, oh, that's the climate columnist or something. But I don't think it is, right? For me, it was like that's mainstream policy making, and it's they're putting a lot of money in, you know,
Yeah,
and they're competing
definitely.
against the United States, which put even more money in it, and and that money's flowing out the door already. So there's a lot of tension there, and so I'd say I was more focused on sort of those big picture things, and I always but I don't think it's because of the Italy, Canada, or U.S. I think it's just the nature of the job in a way.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us. This was a fascinating conversation, and I'll see you around.
Can I say one more thing,
Yeah,
Dale?
absolutely.
So being an American who knew absolutely well, let's say very little about Canada, and then having come here and followed politics, what I did appreciate and what I still do appreciate is the difference between the two countries, right? I mean,
Yeah.
first of all, you have a parliamentary system. I tend to think it works out okay as a government system,
Yeah.
and I appreciate covering it. It's a bit more interesting, I think, with the votes in Parliament and everything else than Congress, and then the bill. Anyway, I just find the process interesting here, and and I really do believe that Canada has its own character, right? It's
Yeah.
not just like the second cousin of the United States, or the poor, or the poor step, or what is it, the poor step brother or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
It really does have its own character, and its own rules, and so on. And so, as an American, I've appreciated Canada on a completely different level than I would ever been able to do, had I not lived here and been able to cover
Yeah.
the government and everything else, right? So
Yeah.
that's all I wanted to say.
All right. Well, that's great. And it's a great note to leave us on. And thanks again for doing this. And see you around.
Thanks, Dale.
And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. It's at journo_Dale on Twitter, and journodale no underscore on Bluesky. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.